The sun was dying slow over the Arizona plains, bleeding red across the horizon like the last breath of some wounded god. The wind came low and restless, carrying dust, dry sage, and the distant rhythm of hooves that no one yet noticed. The light bent over the land, touching the fences, the hollow windmill, and the lonely cabin that sat like a scar against the wide, empty world. Clara Whitlow stood at the edge of her porch, her palms dusted with flour, her sleeves rolled to her elbows. She had the kind of face that had learned to live without softness, sun-browned, lined, steady. Her hair was pinned in a knot, a few strands turning silver, though she wasn't old yet, not truly. The land aged folks faster out here. There was no time for grief, no room for tears. She'd buried her husband 4 winters ago, and though men had come around offering help or hand, she stayed alone. Dead Horse Canyon was her home, and she meant to die on her own soil. The mule brayed from the barn. The chickens were restless, pecking at the dusk like they sensed something coming. Clara poured water into a tin cup, listening to the endless sigh of wind against the windows. It had been another hard day, fence mending, hauling water, chasing coyotes off the coop. She sat by the fire with her Bible, though she hadn't read it in months. The letters blurred now when she tried. Her husband used to read it to her, his voice deep as thunder. Now silence was her sermon. Outside, the night thickened. The sun dropped fully, leaving only a blood-red rim over the distant mesas. Coyotes called. The wind shifted. Then she heard it, not wind, not thunder, but hooves. At first, she thought it might be riders passing through. Travelers sometimes came by for water or a place to rest. But these weren't travelers. The rhythm was wrong, too many hooves, too fast. Her dog, Bandit, stood rigid, ears flat, growling low. Clara stepped onto the porch, lantern in hand. She peered into the distance. A line of riders broke from the horizon, their shapes dark against the dying light. 7 of them, moving fast. She felt her heart tighten. She set the lantern down and ran inside, bolting the door. The first gunshot tore through the stillness, splintering the window above her sink. She ducked low, her breath ragged. The dog barked once, then fell silent with a sharp yelp. Flames flickered outside. Her barn had gone up like dry paper. The horses screamed, "Come out, Miss Whitlow." A voice drawled from the yard, cruel and easy, like a man enjoying the sound of himself. "Ain't no use hiding. We just want to talk." Clara grabbed her husband's shotgun from above the mantel. Her hands trembled, but her eyes were steady. She'd used it once before, when the fever took him. She'd fired it into the sky, just to let the world know she was still here. Now, the world had come back for her. The door shook under her boot. She fired through it. With splintering, a man cursing outside. The smell of smoke and gunpowder filled the room. A second later, the door burst inward, and a shadow filled the frame, tall, broad, wearing a black kerchief over his face. He moved faster than she could reload. His hand struck the gun from hers, sent it spinning across the floor. "Well now," he said, pulling down his mask. His grin was wide and white against tanned skin. "Ain't every day a lady shoots first." He had eyes like glass, cold, unreadable. This was Jace Holloway, though she didn't know his name yet. The others called him Boss, Captain, Reaper, names that meant nothing to her, but would soon enough. "Take her," he said. The others poured in like wolves. They tied her wrists, ignored her screams. The fire outside spread, painting the walls orange. They took what they wanted, food, whiskey, silver. One of them tore her wedding picture from the wall and laughed. When she fought, Jace just watched, leaning against the doorframe. "You've got fight," he said softly. "That's rare. Might be why he liked you." She froze. "Who?" Jace smiled slow. "You'll find out soon enough." He tipped his hat, and the men dragged her out into the night. By the time they rode off, the cabin was half burned. The wind carried sparks into the sagebrush. The sky had gone black, and the stars watched without blinking. Later that night, the townsfolk at Dustwell Saloon heard the story in fragments. Smoke seen on the horizon, riders heading north through the canyon, a woman screaming once before the sound was swallowed by wind. Nobody went after them. Not the marshal, not the cowhands. Nobody wanted to follow men like that into Dead Horse Canyon. Folks around there said it was cursed, that bones whispered in the sand when the wind blew right. 7 masked devils, one man muttered, nursing his drink. Ain't no soul coming back from that. The bartender only wiped the counter and said, maybe one will. The next morning, the smoke was still rising from the Whitlow ranch. Buzzards circled low. The air stank of ash and death. But far beyond that, out where the desert met the sky, a figure moved slow across the land. He was big, too big for most horses, but his black stallion carried him steady. The man's hat cast a shadow across his face. His long duster coat trailed the dust like a storm cloud. There was something about the way he rode. Not hurried, not uncertain, just steady, like a man who'd already made peace with what came next. He stopped at a ridge, looking down toward the smoke. The wind pulled his coat open, showing the worn holsters at his sides. Empty for now. His hands rested on his thighs, scarred and thick. The desert wind caught the brim of his hat and lifted it just enough for the light to touch his face. He looked carved from the same stone as the canyon below. His eyes were pale, distant, like they'd seen too much and come back empty. A voice, old and low, seemed to drift on the wind, not his, but the kind you'd hear from a campfire storyteller somewhere far away. They said he was dead. The man turned his horse north, toward the canyon, where the riders had gone. But death never took him easy. The stallion moved forward, hooves whispering through the dust, leaving no trail anyone dared follow. The dawn came up behind him, slow and bleeding, washing the land in gold and sorrow. And somewhere, out in that cursed canyon, 7 men rode with a captive, laughing, drinking, sure of their power. None of them knew that a storm had just taken shape behind them, a giant on horseback, carrying silence in one hand and judgment in the other. By nightfall, the wind would shift again. The land would remember his name. The morning after the raid broke cold and still, the kind of silence that settles over land after it's tasted fire. Smoke hung low over the charred skeleton of the Whitlow ranch, twisting upward in thin gray ribbons. The smell of burnt wood and sorrow clung to the wind. Buzzards perched on the fence posts, waiting. The windmill creaked once, then gave up. From the south, a lone rider appeared, massive, broad-shouldered, moving slow as if the world itself were heavy. His horse was black, scarred, its mane tangled with dust. The rider's coat, long and sun-bleached at the hem, fluttered with every gust. He didn't rush. Men like him never did. They carried time differently, the way you carry a wound that never healed right. He dismounted beside what was left of the porch. The boards groaned under his boots. He stood there a long while, hat shadowing his eyes, taking in the ruin. His name was Elias Brandt, though few dared say it aloud anymore. The stories folks told about him were half legend, half curse. A ghost out of the Red Rock Massacre, a man who once walked through gunfire and came out untouched. They said he'd died years ago, buried without a grave, mourned by none. But the man standing here now had too much flesh and too much pain to be dead. He knelt by the steps, where the ground was still warm from the fire. Something soft caught his eye, a strip of cloth tangled in the ash. He reached for it, and his fingers closed around a scarf, scorched at the edges, but still holding a faint scent of lavender. He turned it slowly in his hand, staring at the pattern. It was the kind women wore when they still believed mornings were worth dressing for. He knew whose it was. The sound that left him wasn't quite a breath, and not quite a word, just something deep, raw, and human. He closed his hand around the scarf and rose, the light catching the scar across his cheek, a pale streak running from ear to jaw, earned long ago in a different kind of fire. A wagon creaked into view at the edge of the property. The driver pulled up hard when he saw Elias standing there. "Sweet Lord," the man muttered, crossing himself. "It can't be you." Elias didn't look up. "Who rode through here?" "7," the man said quickly. "Masked. Holloway's boys, I reckon. Took the widow. Burned everything." Elias's jaw tightened. "Where'd they ride?" The man hesitated, his eyes darting to the Colt revolver at Elias's side, unloaded, but still enough to make his pulse trip. "North," he said finally. "Through Dead Horse Canyon." But don't follow. Ain't worth it. You go there. You don't come back. Elias turned toward the horizon. Neither did she. The man swallowed, started to say more, but Elias was already walking toward his horse. The black stallion stamped once, sensing what was coming. He slung the saddlebag over his shoulder, paused, and looked back at the smoldering house. The scarf fluttered in his grip like a flag in a forgotten war. He tied it to his wrist. The road into town was narrow, cut between dry gullies and mesquite. Folks stopped what they were doing when they saw him pass. The blacksmith froze mid-swing. The preacher's wife went pale. A boy dropped his bucket at the well. Nobody spoke. The name moved through whispers. Elias Brandt, the giant gunslinger, the man who once rode with the Holloway gang before turning on them. Inside the saloon, voices dropped to silence when he stepped through the doors. Dust swirled in the sudden stillness. The bartender, old and gray with trembling hands, stared like he'd seen a spirit crawl out of its grave. "Whiskey," Elias said. The glass was poured, though the man's hand shook so bad half of it spilled. Elias took it in one swallow, wiped his mouth with the back of his hand, and set the glass down gentle. "You seen Holloway?" The bartender didn't answer. Elias leaned forward, eyes pale as frost. "You've seen him." The man's voice came out small. "He rides north. Heard tell he's got a hideout near the Canyon Pass. Folks don't go there. Rocks echo strange. Sometimes you hear gunfire when there ain't none." Elias nodded once. "He took a woman. Clara Whitlow." The bartender's eyes dropped. "She's good folk. Ain't right what they did." Elias pushed the empty glass away. "No, it ain't." He turned to leave, but the bartender called after him, voice cracking. "Brent, you sure you want to go back to that life?" Elias paused at the door. The light from outside hit his face, and for a moment, the years peeled away. Beneath the grit and shadow, there was something hollowed but human. A man who'd lost more than he ever found. "I buried that life once," he said quietly. "But the ground don't hold what's meant to rise." He stepped out into the blinding light. The wind met him head-on, carrying dust and memory. He could almost hear her laugh. The way she'd lean against the porch rail and call his name when supper was ready. That was before everything turned to blood. Before Holloway and his kin tore through Red Rock, killing settlers for sport. Elias had ridden with them then, young and mean, too proud to see the devil in their smiles. When the smoke cleared, 30 men lay dead, and 2 children too small to understand why. That night, he'd turned his gun on his own gang. 6 went into the ground before dawn. Holloway had escaped bleeding, swearing vengeance. The papers called Elias a monster. The marshal called him a traitor. His wife, his only mercy, had begged him to stop. And when she died from fever, he'd buried his guns beside her grave and walked away from the world. Until now. He reached the edge of town where the land opened wide, the sky a burning pale blue. The stallion waited, patient as stone. Elias crouched by the saddlebag and pulled out the twin Colts. The metal caught the sun, dull and clean. His fingers moved slow, reverent, as he loaded each chamber. The sound of the bullets, clicking home, echoed like heartbeat. He holstered both, feeling their weight settle against his sides. For years, he'd told himself the weight was gone. He was wrong. It had only been sleeping. He looked north, where the canyon waited like a wound in the earth. His shadow stretched long across the dust. "For her," he whispered, voice rough as gravel. "I ride again." The horse shifted beneath him as he mounted. The first gust of wind caught the brim of his hat, and for a heartbeat, the world felt alive again, dangerous, burning, righteous. He nudged the reins, and the stallion moved. Behind him, the town faded into silence. No one spoke his name, not because they didn't remember it, but because they did. By noon, the sun was merciless, turning the world to glass and fire. He rode through gulches where the bones of cattle lay white as chalk, past dry creeks that once sang with water. He followed the faint tracks of 7 horses burned into the dust. Each hoof print was a heartbeat closer to reckoning. At dusk, he reached the edge of Dead Horse Canyon. The sky bled purple, clouds like smoke curling above the cliffs. He dismounted, hand brushing the rock face that rose like the wall of some forgotten cathedral. The wind howled through the canyon, carrying whispers that weren't quite words. He stood there a long while, hat in hand, the scarf still tied around his wrist. It fluttered softly, like it wanted to return home. He looked up at the darkening sky. "You ain't gone yet," he murmured. "Not till I bring her back." He untied the scarf, folded it careful, and placed it inside his coat pocket close to his heart. Then he stepped forward into the canyon's mouth, where shadows swallowed sound and the rocks watched in silence. Elias rode through the dead heart of the frontier, where the land itself seemed scorched by old sins. The sun hung low and cruel, painting the mesas in gold and rust. Dust curled behind him like smoke from a ghost fire. He followed the faint tracks of 7 horses through the Badlands, their prints baked hard into the earth. Each one led him deeper into country where men disappeared and were never spoken of again. Days bled together. Nights came sharp and cold. Coyotes howled in the distance, and the stars looked like pinholes in the lid of a dark coffin. Elias didn't sleep much. He rode by moonlight, his breath turning white in the cold air, his mind filled with the scent of burning wood and the sound of Clara's scream. By the 3rd day, the trail bent toward the canyon ridge, winding between walls of redstone that rose high and narrow. He stopped only once, to refill his canteen at a trickle of muddy water. That's where he found the first sign of them: ashes from a campfire, a whiskey bottle half buried in sand, a woman's ribbon caught on a thorn. He pocketed the ribbon and kept riding. The world was silent except for the whisper of wind and the creak of leather. His horse's hooves struck the earth like a drumbeat of judgment. He hadn't spoken to a soul since Dust Well, and he preferred it that way, until he saw the glint of a badge in the distance. A man waited by the trail, slouched in his saddle, rifle resting across his lap. The tin star on his vest caught the sun. Marshal Harlan Pike. His beard was white, his eyes dark as mud, the kind of man who'd buried more friends than he could count. He raised a hand when Elias drew near. "Heard you was alive," Pike said. "Was hoping it was just rumor." Elias reined in his horse. "You're riding a long way from town, Marshal." "Following you." Pike spat dust from his mouth. "Folks are scared. You show up, bad things start happening." "I remember Red Rock." Elias didn't blink. "You remember wrong. I remember blood. A whole town's worth." The marshal leaned forward. "You riding after Holloway?" Elias looked north. "He took a woman. Burned her ranch. Justice ain't yours no more," Pike said quietly. "You buried that life." Elias's gaze hardened, voice flat as iron. "Wasn't yours when they took her." The marshal's jaw worked. He looked like a man choking on truth too old to swallow. Finally, he sighed and pulled his hat low. "Ain't no law in that canyon. Just ghosts and graves." "Then I'll fit right in." Elias touched the brim of his hat, nudged his horse forward, and left Pike staring after him, the dust swallowing his shape. That night, the outlaws made camp in the mouth of the canyon. The fire threw orange light across their faces, masks pulled down, laughter sharp and ugly. Clara sat bound to a wagon wheel, her face streaked with soot. She stared into the flames, refusing to cry. Jace Holloway lounged nearby, playing cards on a saddle blanket, his revolver laid beside him like a promise. One of the men, Riker, the youngest, stood guard near the horses. He thought he saw movement among the rocks. A trick of moonlight, maybe. Then something hissed, a bullet splitting the air, and his lantern shattered, plunging him into darkness. Another whisper came, and he dropped where he stood, a hole in his throat. The horses screamed, pulling at their reins. By the time the others scrambled for their guns, the night had gone silent again. No shooter, no tracks, just the wind, whispering through the canyon like it was laughing. Jace's hand trembled as he poured whiskey into a tin cup. "We keep moving at dawn," he said. "Whoever's out there wants to die. He'll have his turn." Clara didn't speak, but her heart pounded with something she hadn't felt in days. Hope. Far off, under a jagged ridge, Elias cleaned his colt by moonlight. He worked in silence, the motion slow, practiced. The wind pressed against him like a living thing. He remembered Pike's words, the look in his eyes, Justice ain't yours no more. Maybe not. But vengeance didn't need permission. He rode at dawn, the canyon swallowing sound. He found the body of Riker half buried in dust, eyes open, mouth full of sand. Elias didn't stop. He counted 6 left. 3 nights it went on. Each time they made camp, one of them vanished before morning. Throats cut clean. Rifles missing. Their food gone. The survivors whispered around the fire, jumpy as animals. It ain't human, one said. No man moves like that. Jace stared into the flames, jaw tight. He ain't a man, he muttered. He's a curse we left behind. By the 4th night, even the horses seemed afraid. Claire's wrists were raw from rope. She'd begun to hear it too, the slow, steady echo of hooves in the distance, drawing closer each time. Gunfire rolled faint across the cliffs, like thunder that didn't belong to any storm. In the half-light of dawn, she caught sight of him, a shape moving through the fog, tall and silent, coat trailing like smoke. She thought she was dreaming until she saw the gleam of metal at his side. The giant gunslinger, the man the townsfolk whispered about when the whiskey was low and the wind howled through the shutters. Her heart broke open. Elias moved through the canyon like a shadow made of bone and will. Every rock, every echo spoke to him. The Holloways had chosen a spot deep in the gorge, boxed in by cliffs. It made them feel safe. That was their mistake. He climbed the ridge under cover of darkness, his boots leaving no sound. The camp lay below. 5 men left now, restless, drunk, arguing in low growls. Clara was still tied, slumped with exhaustion. Elias slid down the slope, the barrel of his Colt gleaming faintly in starlight. He moved behind the wagons, cutting ropes, untying horses. One snorted, stamping the ground, and a guard turned. Elias fired once, the sound muffled against the canyon walls. The man dropped without a sound. Jace woke to the smell of smoke. He stumbled from his bedroll, hand groping for his gun, eyes wild. The campfire had gone out, and something was burning. The rope around the prisoner's wrists, sliced clean and tossed into the flames. Clara was gone. Elias led her through the rocks, one hand steadying her as they moved. She stumbled once, dizzy, but he caught her before she fell. She looked up at him, the shadow of his face caught in the thin glow of dawn. "You came back," she whispered, voice trembling. He looked at her a long moment, the faintest ache in his eyes. Didn't know how to stay gone. Behind them, gunfire cracked. Bullets sparked off the stone. Elias turned, firing twice. 2 silhouettes fell. He pulled Clara close and led her higher into the ridge, where the rocks split into a narrow trail. When the echoes died, only one man was left alive in the canyon below, Jace Holloway, standing amid his dead, his face pale beneath the blood. He stared at the rising sun and spat into the dirt. "You can't hide from me, Brant," he shouted. "You're already dead." Elias didn't answer. His eyes followed the horizon, the color of it, the promise it carried. He knew the reckoning wasn't finished. Not yet. But Clara was breathing free air again, and that was enough for now. They reached a shallow cave, where the canyon widened. He helped her sit, handed her a canteen. Her hand shook as she drank. For the first time since the fire, tears came, silent clean. He looked away, giving her the dignity of privacy, though every breath she took felt like a prayer answered too late. She turned to him, voice small. "You shouldn't have come." He smiled faintly, the kind that never reached his eyes. Didn't have a choice. The morning rose pale and sharp, like a blade drawn from its sheath. Dead Horse Canyon lay wrapped in mist, the sun bleeding slowly through the cracks of stone. The world was quiet, except for the rasp of wind weaving through the cliffs. Dust drifted like ash over the dead. The echo of gunfire from the night before still hung in the air, as if the canyon itself refused to forget. Elias Brant stood on the ridge, his coat heavy with dust, his eyes hollow with resolve. Below him, campfires smoldered among the rocks, the remnants of Jace Holloway's gang. What few men were left were ghosts already. They just didn't know it. Clara rested behind the ridge, wrapped in his coat. She was weak but alive. He'd promised himself she would see another dawn, even if he didn't. He drew in the cold air, felt it burn his lungs. The sun rose higher, washing the canyon in blood-red light. Elias checked his revolvers, both fully loaded, the metal worn smooth by years of use and memory. His fingers brushed over the scarf, tied around his wrist. The fabric was frayed, the scent of smoke long gone, but it carried something deeper, a reason. Below, Jace was shouting orders, his voice cutting through the silence. "Fan out. He's up there somewhere." The men moved, jittery, eyes darting to every shadow. They didn't see him until it was too late. The first shot cracked like lightning. A man dropped beside the fire, his hat spinning away. The rest froze. Another shot, clean, deliberate. The echo slammed against the canyon walls, rolling back on itself. Elias moved from rock to rock, silent as the wind. The shadows worked for him. The terrain remembered his kind. Years of blood and dust had taught him every way a man could die and every place he could disappear. A third outlaw fell, then a fourth. Panic spread through the camp like wildfire. "He's everywhere," one shouted, firing blindly into the cliffs. The bullets sparked harmlessly off stone. Another tried to run, but a single gunshot sent him sprawling into the dirt. By the time the echoes died, only Jace Holloway remained. He stood alone in the open, face drawn tight, gun in hand. The wind tugged at his coat. His shadow stretched long across the ground. He turned slowly, scanning the ridges, and called out, "Come on out, Brad. Let's finish this proper." Elias stepped from behind a boulder, his revolver loose at his side. He walked slow, deliberate, boots crunching over gravel. The two men faced each other with 20 yards between them, framed by cliffs that rose like walls of a graveyard. Jace grinned, though there was no humor in it. "You think killing me will bring peace?" Elias's voice was low, steady, shaped by grief. "Peace died with her. I'm just here to bury the noise." The wind paused, as if the world itself wanted to hear the end. Both men moved at once. 2 flashes. 2 cracks of thunder. The canyon roared back their defiance. Elias's bullet struck first. Jace staggered, disbelief frozen on his face. He looked down at the red blooming on his shirt, then up at the man who'd come back from the grave to end him. He tried to speak, but all that came out was a rasp, a ghost of laughter, swallowed by the wind. He fell to his knees, then to the dust. Elias stood still, revolver smoking. The silence that followed was deeper than death. For a long time, neither the wind nor the world dared move. When he finally walked toward the fallen outlaw, there was no triumph in his step, only weight. He looked down at Jace Holloway, the man who had once been his brother in arms, his mirror in sin, the man who'd taken everything that once made life worth keeping. "You should have stayed buried," Elias murmured. He holstered his gun, turned, and walked away. Behind him, the canyon seemed to exhale. The mist lifted, the sun spilling across stone like forgiveness that came too late. Elias climbed back toward the ridge, where Clara waited. She stirred when she saw him, her eyes wide and glassy. For a heartbeat, she thought she was dreaming again. "It's done," he said softly. She tried to rise, but her body trembled. He lifted her gently, his arms steady as granite. She leaned into him, weak but unbroken. He carried her down through the canyon, through the bones of the night's battle, past the men who'd written their own epitaphs in lead and dust. The air grew warmer as they reached the mouth of the gorge. Birds circled above, cautious but curious, as if life were waiting for permission to return. Elias stopped beside a shallow creek, set Clara down on a smooth rock, and crouched beside the water. He washed his hands, watching the crimson swirl away downstream. Clara's voice was a whisper. "You're bleeding." He looked at the graze on his arm, smiled faintly. "Not enough." She studied him for a long time, the hard lines of his face, the sadness carved deeper than the scars. "Where will you go now?" He didn't answer. His eyes were on the horizon, where the desert stretched endless and empty. After a while, he stood and unbuckled his gun belt. The revolvers hung heavy, their steel dulled by years of war. He laid them down beside the creek, the sound of metal on stone final as a prayer. Clara frowned. "You can't just leave them." "They've done enough talking." From his coat pocket, he pulled a folded scrap of paper. He set it under one of the pistols, weighted with a flat stone, so the wind wouldn't steal it. Clara watched him, confusion and sorrow mingling in her eyes. What does it say? He met her gaze, the faintest trace of warmth flickering there. Something I should have known long ago. He turned to his horse, tightened the saddle. She wanted to ask him to stay, to say something that might tether him to the living world, but she saw it in his eyes. He was already half gone. He swung into the saddle, the rising sun cutting his silhouette into gold and shadow. Clara stood, calling after him, but the wind swallowed her words. He didn't look back. By the time the townsfolk found her days later, she was safe but alone. They followed her tracks to the creek and found the 2 revolvers resting in the sand, untouched, gleaming faintly in the afternoon light. The note beneath them was short, written in a steady hand that seemed to belong to the earth itself. A man's size don't make him giant, what he carries inside does. They buried Jace Holloway and his men in shallow graves in the canyon, but nobody spoke much during the work. The preacher said a few words that got lost to the wind. When it was done, the marshal looked toward the ridge and said quietly, "Let him rest." Years passed. Dead Horse Canyon grew quiet again. Grass crept between the rocks. The river ran clearer. The story of that morning became legend, retold around campfires, passed down in whispers. They said no outlaw ever lived to tell what happened that day. They said no man ever saw Elias Brandt again. But when storms rolled across the desert, thunder echoing through the canyons, some swore they could hear the beat of hooves, slow, steady, relentless. And if you stood at the edge of that canyon when the wind turned just right, you might hear a voice carried with the rain, low, haunted, and human. Some men ride for gold, some for glory, but he rode for ghosts.